Bryce Young versus CJ Stroud. Maybe you've heard of it. Yeah, it's kind of a big thing right now. As of today, I believe Bryce Young pulled ahead a little bit in the odds in favor of him going to the Carolina Panthers. Personally, I honestly don't think the Panthers at this point know exactly who they're even leaning towards because the GM, Scott Fitterer, has a policy where he doesn't want Frank Reich to tell him who he likes. He's not going to tell Frank Reich who Scott Fitterer himself likes. That way they don't influence each other. They don't let their bias creep in or have their opinion affected. So I think it's still very much going to be a debate at some point, or maybe just they'll come to consensus there with Carolina. I was planning on doing something else today, but as I was going through finding like as many former NFL quarterbacks and receivers as I could to comment on these various quarterbacks, I stumbled onto Steve Smith's YouTube channel, Cut to It, and it was him and James Palmer talking about the top four quarterbacks prospects. They might have talked about Hendon Hooker as well. And it was awesome. Like, I think I saw a side of Steve Smith that he doesn't typically get to show on NFL Network. And James Palmer, I've loved forever. Players and coaches really open up to James Palmer. He used to be here at CSN Houston, and we worked together there. But they had some really, really good nuggets and insight. And Steve Smith, I would say, as you please subscribe to his podcast, I linked it down here and at the end, and I'll put the link at the end out to him as well. He loves Bryce Young. That's no secret to anybody. If you saw him gush over him at the Alabama Pro Day, you know that Steve Smith loves Bryce Young. He does point out some of the areas where CJ Stroud likely has an advantage, and he points out some of Bryce Young's detriments. One of which we'll get to that I haven't heard a lot of people say or focus on, and I'm kind of surprised now that Steve Smith has said it. But Steve Smith, who I think might succumb to the halo effect a little bit with Bryce Young, to where almost anything Bryce Young does is going to be good because Steve Smith loves him so much. He's not bashful about it. We'll start off with Steve Smith talking about the leadership skills and ability of Bryce Young.
I've met Bryce Young 3 times now.
Mm-hmm.
And in meeting Bryce Young, every time I've met him, I've walked away all 3 times learning something more about him that's intriguing. The first thing that is intriguing is his dad is a psychologist. So he's grown up with the ability to read people, but he's a sit back, observe, evaluate, and then speak. And I like that about him because he's measured. And you don't have to teach him. That's who he is.
Okay, so also, is my mic back?
Even though
if it is or not. As far as that goes, okay, his father is a psychiatrist. That comes into play a little bit in something we're going to talk about later. I do think that when it comes to being a buttoned up, if not loud speaker or anything like that, I think he just seems a little bit more polished in that respect and in that regard in some ways than CJ Stroud is. And I think part of that might just be an offshoot of Bryce Young having been the guy, from the time he was in high school on up, whereas CJ Stroud is a little bit later to it and has kind of an underdog mentality. I think you guys who have watched the channel know that I'm much more impressed with CJ Stroud's personality and leadership ability than I was before. I think he's got an understated element to it that people really respect once they get to know him. It just doesn't strike you in the face like the way, sometimes the cameras like those guys more and it's not genuine leadership. With both these guys, I think they've got plenty of leadership. James Palmer, in discussing that, talks a story that some of us have heard, but James has heard a lot more about it, the Bill O'Brien dynamic at Alabama.
smaller in stature, don't you get like a vibe when he walks up to you that there's just kind of like this vibe, this confidence, this like, I don't know, just kind of this feel to him, even though he just carries himself in a manner when you just approach him and talk to him that has a lot of those leadership type of qualities that you're talking about. And it's even unspoken, even before he opened his mouth.
Yes.
I felt that when we talked.
Okay, I had to point out there too. You see the look on Steve. Steve Smith is beaming there at the end. The way he was gushing over him at the pro day, he just wasn't caught up in the moment there. Steve Smith is genuinely in love with the football player Bryce Young, not in a weird way or anything, not like in a cable guy type of obsessive way. I think that he genuinely 100% believes all these things that he's saying. Um, I'll go like the live. So let me see. You got J Rock. You got me messed up a little bit. Am I still muted? Damn it! All right. All right. Let me know if I'm still muted. There's several of you here. I think that sometimes Steve Smith, it's fun because he's relatively new to this whole scouting people and everything. God damn it! This is what happens with live. Mike's a little quiet. We'll try that and see if that does any better. Yeah, up the gain. All right. Tell me if that gets any better, because it might just be something different. Okay, so as far as Steve Smith, I think like he doesn't have like that detachment that scouts try to get or maintain, and I like that about him because he's Steve Smith. He's not supposed to be calm, cool, and collected all the time. I don't think. Let's see. He didn't. James Palmer didn't get to the Bill O'Brien part yet.
When Bill O'Brien got there, he kind of like took OB aside and was like, all right, this is how we do this. This is how we do these. And like more or less taught him the early portions of the offense. Like to do that with your new offensive coordinator who just came from the NFL as a head coach for a number of years and work with Tom Brady the number of years that he did, to have the confidence to go to your OC and say, all right, here, I'm going to show you how we do it. That takes some stones and some confidence in how you go about running this offense.
Yeah, and again, this is kind of divided up into chunks, so you're going to hear a lot of positives on Bryce Young before we get to CJ Stroud. But the Bill O'Brien dynamic is interesting just because for a couple of reasons, actually. One is, all right, as far as I know, Caserio and Bill O'Brien still get along. Whatever fallout there was between Easterby and Bill O'Brien, I don't think that affects that love triangle or quadrilateral, whatever the hell goes on with these New England types. But I think that like Bill O'Brien was very impressed with Bryce Young in a lot of ways, and we'll hear a little bit more about that later. But the other part too is I'm trying to reopen my mind as far as a lot of the positives about Bryce Young and his football IQ, his processing, all these things. He's been challenged more by Bill O'Brien than most college quarterbacks would be challenged. And not every quarterback would be able to do the things that Bill O'Brien is going to want his quarterbacks to do. So it's certainly a notch in his favor, in Bryce Young's favor, that he responded to Bill O'Brien's coaching and is able to do some higher level stuff. But there's some things and some elements to it that like CJ Stroud and other quarterbacks may not have even been asked to do. So you got to try to figure out, okay, if CJ Stroud were to be asked to operate at that level of complexity, is CJ Stroud going to be able to latch onto that as well? I don't know. That's why the scouts get paid to be right nearly 25% of the time.
There is limited time that you have with your defense to win them over.
Oh, okay. So this is good. This is DeMeco Ryan specific. This is DeMeco Ryan's and conversations he's had about, like, and I think Brock Purdy factors into this in San Francisco. Your quarterback's got to be able to win over the defense too. Think about Seattle, okay? And the way it was up there with Russell Wilson when Richard Sherman and those guys used to openly mock him.
And that's huge in DeMeco's eyes if you can win that side over. And I remember talking to somebody on that side of the ball at Bama last year, and it's probably my favorite pro day quote of all time. And they said to me, man, you drop him in a pit for rattlesnakes, his heart don't go up one beat.
So that sounds like that's a good SEC coach compliment or player. This is a good old boy from somewhere complimenting him like that. And I think that meets the eye test. I think CJ Stroud probably matches that as well, as far as just being, those fighter pilot types that don't get moved emotionally up or down. They're just gonna do what's got to be done. Because like Joe Montana would be one of the best examples of that. So I think I think that CJ Stroud has more of that than perhaps people again want to believe. I think like I get this sense as these guys talk that Alabama does a really good job of telling the story of their players. And I'm not going to say Ryan Day doesn't or anything. There's just been more aura and mystique built up around Bryce Young than there has been CJ Stroud, and maybe that's for good reason. Maybe that's simply because he's earned it and he's that kind of guy. I mean, we've heard both these guys, Steve Smith and James Palmer. They're like they meet a lot of guys. They're not easily snowed. I don't think there is something about Bryce Young's persona or his charisma, or his personality that has impressed him. As far as Steve Smith and his love for Bryce Young, this is interesting because this is where a little bit of the halo effect comes in. I could see this little tidbit being portrayed as a negative if you don't like Bryce Young. Steve Smith very much sees it as a positive.
On Sunday, they would do the game plan, right? So Sunday, for obviously for college, they play Saturday. So they get the game plan. They said by Monday, he already had his list of adjustments that he wanted to see in his offense. Now, I'm not saying CJ does not have that in him. I'm just telling you what they told us while we were there, right? Mm-hmm. Now, CJ could be a great leader as well. I'm not saying he's not. I'm just giving you the intel that they've given us that you got to go, wow.
Yeah, so you got to go, wow. I think there, like, as far as, like, I think the way Steve Smith phrased it, as I listened to it again, is, okay, the adjustments that Bryce Young wants to see. I'd be surprised if that's the approach he takes, as much as the coach is maybe soliciting and then him giving his opinions on what he likes, what he doesn't like. Adjustments is kind of a loaded phrase. So regardless, I think in fairness to CJ Stroud, also Steve Smith is saying that's what Alabama told them. I don't know if Steve Smith has had those conversations or conversations like that with Ohio State, but just much like I was with CJ Stroud's personality, I knew a lot more about Bryce Young's personality than I did CJ Stroud's personality. I had to go and seek it out and prove myself wrong on a couple things. So I'm still very much trying to keep as open a mind as possible when it comes to some of those stuff. My God. J-Rock, you're killing me here. All right.
Bill O'Brien said after a year with Bryce, he's like, I've never been around another quarterback like this, the way he's wired, ever. And like I mentioned, he's been with some pretty talented quarterbacks, Brady being one of them. Like, there is something about him that sets him apart. And everything that you mentioned, Steve, like I'm going through my head, like with all four guys. And I'm like, yeah, Bryce checks that. He checks that. He checks that. He checked every one of them. The only concern is the size.
Yeah. So, apologies to you, J-Rock. I need your help. Thank you very much. And then just keep giving me the feedback on the microphone. We'll end up getting 5 good minutes out of all of this. As far as what we heard right there, look, Bill, this is again, like, that's over the top. Like, okay, is Bill O'Brien? All right, let's see. Tell me if this is okay. Is Bill O'Brien just like, is it possible that somebody is actually wired in like a more competitive, more organized, more concise way than Tom Brady? Like, I have a hard time believing that. So I don't know if that's maybe James hearing it a certain type of way. If it's Bill O'Brien still mad that Tom Brady yelled at him, or what it might be, I gotta think that, okay, maybe he's on par with Tom Brady, because Tom Brady was at a level where it was kind of, you know what I could see. Tom Brady was at a point in his career where he was going to start making some decisions for himself and maybe more independently minded, where, when Bryce Young is still in the yes sir, no sir mode, with very few no sirs, just yes sir, yes sir, yes sir. O'Brien probably really appreciated somebody like that, and perhaps he meant to a younger player. But suffice it to say, Bryce Young just checks off so many of those boxes in terms of, is this going to be a guy who's absolutely obsessed with it? It's hard to find somebody who doesn't believe that. Okay, so this is interesting because, again, here's another one about CJ Stroud and how teams tried to test him. And at first, I thought this was going to be a negative, especially when you got the whole David Mulligetta connection rolling around in your brain, who, by the way, Bryce Young is also represented by David Mulligetta, but only on the endorsement side. CAA represents him for the contract negotiation side.
Things like Steve and I talked about this with CJ Stroud. Like, some of the teams really try to push his buttons because he's super competitive. Yeah. Like, he's really competitive, and they wanted to kind of like push his buttons, see what irritates him, whatnot. And he kind of puffed his chest and came back at him. The teams that did it that I talked to loved it. Like,
right. But that was their intention.
But that was their intention. They wanted to see if he would cower, like if he would just. They don't. Some teams are like, I don't want you just to straight believe everything I say. Right. Ask me who, what, why, how, and when.
Yeah, no, like that part of it. That's something I always heard about Bill Parcells, which was really interesting to me. Aaron Glenn used to tell me that. Like, Aaron Glenn said, Bill Parcells was going to push your buttons, and he didn't want puppies. You know, he wanted dogs that were going to bite back. So he would test your, to see how tough you were and everything. Which is that one's always tough for me because I feel like depending on what kind of household you grew up in, like you might still really want to kill him as he's saying that stuff to you, but you grew up in a household where there are consequences and repercussions. So I don't know about that, but I do think that with CJ Stroud, I think that because he's not this really outward extroverted type of personality, but he is very competitive. I do wonder if maybe people, scouts, coaches, thought, is this guy insecure? Is he going to get sensitive when I coach him? Can I test him? And is he going to come back at me? But in a way, the guys go at it each other with each other at times. Like ideally, guys in construction know what I'm talking about. Like sometimes you gotta yell at each other or yell at another sub or something like that, and then you forget about it. I think that maybe they wanted to test him in that way. I was listening to somebody the other day who's talking about really ultra driven and successful people tend to have three things in common. One of which is a belief that they are better than others, or at least destined for greatness, or just in some way superior to others, coupled with a paradoxical insecurity. Like, so you're very confident in some regards, but you also have deep insecurities that you're trying to, either repress or fill these voids or whatever. And the third thing is just simply the ability to delay gratification. So I think with those first two things, if you're a quiet guy, but you're ultra competitive and, like CJ's always got a little bit, it looks almost like a scowl or a super serious face. I wonder if they just wanted to see, hey, Kate, like, does this guy respond to being tested or challenged in a way that's different than Josh Rosen, perhaps, was a name that came up in these guys' podcast a bunch. I don't know why, but it did. So that's interesting. I'm glad to hear if that was the Texans that they liked the way he responded to it. That's a good sign. This also is another one where I was trying to figure out whether Steve Smith was giving CJ Stroud a backhanded compliment or not on his calm demeanor.
Josh Rosen, and I wasn't there and I don't know, but Josh Rosen at times, if you walk in a room pissed off, that's a whole different.
Okay, so they had referenced something about how Josh Rosen would tell coaches what he did and didn't like about an offense in a bad way.
Different conversation.
Yeah,
like
that's
you walk in talking about, I don't like the way you run the slant. You don't sit your little self down, right?
Yeah.
That's
not. And by the way, that's not CJ. Like he's a California relaxed dude.
Yes, almost where you're going. Hey, we may need you to go in the cup because you're really a little bit too relaxed.
Yeah, right? Like he was like enjoying the pro day.
Yes,
like, he was just kind of like hanging out with everybody.
Yeah, he was living a dream. He was like, you know what? Instead of my finkster getting tight, like an overthinker like Will Levis, man, let me go out here, man, and live up this moment. I get to throw with my guys for one more time.
So I'm gonna call it a sphinxter from now on. Joe Mama says, how do you simultaneously have the quietest and the loudest microphone known to man? I think it's a matter of, I've got a loose connection here somewhere. So I think just like one little jostling does something to it. As far as the laid back demeanor, yeah. And I think the thing that Steve Smith said about him enjoying being with the guys one last time, that was another question I had about CJ Stroud early on. Was it just for whatever reason, again, I don't know if it's just the PR campaign or what, but it felt like I heard Bryce Young reference his teammates a lot more, or maybe that was selective hearing on my part. And it's false. That's a false perception that I had. I think CJ Stroud talks a lot about his teammates. And in the interview we watched last week, it was very much focused on every question. He'd be asked a question about himself. He would turn it back towards his teammates. So that part of it was encouraging, I thought. This next one is Steve Smith on Bryce Young's superior processing. The thumbnail for this video, I believe, says something like not even close or something like that, which is about this specific thing. I do believe Steve Smith thinks and understands that these two prospects are closer in evaluation than maybe some people believe. It's just that Steve Smith, who I think I just called Steve Young, Steve Smith is way more positive on Bryce Young in a lot of ways, especially the mental processing.
Let's get into it. Bryce, I love Bryce has a strong arm, pure placement, right? Accuracy. His processing is head above CJ. I'm telling you right now, teams have told me CJ Stroud is a fantastic football player, and he's an okay process. When you compare him to Bryce Young, it ain't even in the same ballpark, doggy. It's not. CJ is taller. Bryce is shorter. Bryce processing is taller. CJ's processing is shorter when you compare the two. It's not, I'm talking about it's in the 70s, 80s. And CJ is not in the 70s or 80s. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and again, without taking anything away from Bryce Young at all, I have honest questions about this, and this is part of the hazards of trying to project college guys to the NFL. I do wonder exactly what it would look like if you just transpose these two quarterbacks. If you put Bryce Young in CJ Stroud's system in Ohio and CJ Stroud came down to Alabama, I still think that Bryce Young would survive the transition better. I do see and understand a certain rapidity with which he processes things and makes decisions and kind of understands what's unfolding in front of him. I think he sees the game differently. But I also think that Bill O'Brien, in teaching a lot of the things the way he does teach his system, it's hard. It's hard on a quarterback, but it does give them a certain set of tools, especially pre-snap, that allows them to pre-read the defense, to understand, like, instead of going through your progressions 1, 2, 3, you skip 1 and 2 because you know it's 3. There's just more of that if you're doing the Bill O'Brien system the right way, between setting the protections, getting the play dialed up correctly, and it's going to be an amped down version that they did in college than in the NFL. It's faster. It just works better when done properly. It's like the crane kick. When done properly, no can defend. It's really hard to do it properly. And that's why Brian Hoyer and Ryan Mallett and various other people were not able to replicate the Tom Brady experience with Bill O'Brien. So I think that you can't take away from Bryce Young the fact that he was able to do those things, but CJ Stroud, I think, was operating in a system that's a little bit more cut and dry, a little bit more of if A, then B, and sometimes even on the more complicated stuff where he's waiting for option routes to develop and everything, it's still relatively cut and dry. So that's not his fault, and it can look more robotic and mechanical. And that's why I put Bryce Young above CJ Stroud in that regard. I just try to keep that in mind, that the system could matter. Now, this next part that James Palmer starts talking about with the processing. This is interesting, and we'll go back to also, if you jumped in since the very beginning, when apparently my mic wasn't working anyway. Bryce Young's father is a psychiatrist. I find it very interesting that Bryce Young is accelerating in this one area.
So this is the way the teams are evaluating right now between the two of them. Daniel Jeremiah kind of leaked this. It's private information, but the S2 cognitive processing deal where like 6 shapes pop up and you figure out, you hit the one that's different right away. It's how quickly you process this or whatever in this test. And like Josh Allen was off the charts. Mahomes was off the charts.
I believe Mahomes was in almost 98%. But
yeah, like those two guys were bonkers. Brock Purdy was number 1 among quarterbacks last year in this test. And the number 1 quarterback this year was Bryce Young. Like, this is valued, which this is something, just take it for what you want. Like, Brock Purdy was number 1 last year. Who is running the show in Houston with the number 2 pick? DeMeco Ryans and Bobby Slowick, both coming out of San Francisco.
Yeah, like, so that's a big one, I think. And I've been reading about this S2 Cognition test for a while. And before Daniel Jeremiah kind of broke it, it had been written about in a smaller fashion several weeks ago. And yeah, Bryce Young, it's been known for a while that Bryce Young had the highest score of this year's class, but nobody knows what the other scores are. It's funny because it's kind of being treated like the Wonderlic, where they finally realized after years and years, like, hey, maybe putting people's IQ scores out there isn't the coolest thing in the world. This one's not an actual IQ test. It's visual recognition and being able to see things like at almost like a subliminally perceptive interval. Like, really good quarterbacks, really good safeties, really good cornerbacks tend to excel at it. So they've been using this now. The only question I have about it is that in the article I had read, they referenced Bryce Young and that Bryce Young had been doing it for a while. His father's a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I'm not, whatever Steve Smith said he was. I'm taking Steve Smith's word for it. I think that I just wonder how many times Bryce Young has done it. And that also, okay, you know, with any kind of these tests, people, the people that make the tests always try to claim like, well, no, you don't actually get better with practice. That's bogus. Like, there isn't a test that you don't get better at with practice other than like a breathalyzer and a pregnancy test. Other than that, almost every test out there, if you practice it, you get better. My Wonderlic, my SATs, like these standardized tests that I gamed to get much higher scores than I actually deserved, I got it by practicing those tests. So likewise, I think you can practice that test and get a lot better at it. But I guess my question too is the skills that you develop in learning and doing that test, do they actually cross over? You know, can you actually get better at football and by getting better at that specific test? I don't know. But it's fascinating. I wouldn't mind if this is like this is the equivalent of like a 4.1540. Getting a really good test on this S2. That'd be really cool if it is. The thing is, if the Panthers choose Bryce Young, we'll never know. At least with the Texans, exactly what they felt about it. So we'll see. I'm skeptical of this psychologist father dynamic here. I got this vision of Bryce Young being raised in a lab as a youngster, except somehow they couldn't do anything about his height. They should have thrown some growth hormone at him at some point. All right, so this is the part that's also very relevant to the Texans, is the type of thrower that CJ Stroud is. And James Palmer is going to point something out here about CJ Stroud that I think is very appealing to anybody in a Kubshanistani system.
So what teams have loved about CJ, which is rare for college quarterbacks, is when he goes through his progressions and he processes, he doesn't just go through it with his eyes and his arm. He goes through it with his feet, which is a rare thing for college quarterbacks. They do not do it very well. CJ Stroud does that very well. Now, he may process a little slower than, say, Bryce Young is going through these, but he is already ready to release the football because of his mechanics and his footwork, which I'm saying brings him up a little bit and where he's lacking maybe in one spot.
Yeah. So, and you know, you think about the checks against guys like Will Levis and Anthony Richardson, the mechanics, those things that like all these quarterbacks coaches and offensive coordinators think they can fix, and yet so few of them ever fix it. Jordan Palmer, I think, did some really good work with Josh Allen, and Dak Prescott got better with his accuracy when he got to the NFL, but very few and far between people that can actually fix it. So when you've got a guy who's got those mechanics and is going through, and again, we talked about, okay, is CJ Stroud an okay processor? Well, if when you're running a West Coast type system, your reads are tied to your footwork. When you go and you do a 5-step drop on your back foot, you're making that first read. And you take a step in your second read, take a step, third read. The ball's coming out on time and in rhythm. It can look methodical. It is methodical. And that's why so many guys that played for Kubiak over the years, or Kyle Shanahan, you get the best out of those guys. It doesn't turn a mediocre quarterback into a great quarterback, but it turns a mediocre quarterback into a very good, almost like genuinely good quarterback, because there's a system, there's a rhythm, there's a timing to it. It's paint by numbers. But in some respects, when somebody's good with that, okay, it can look almost robotic. It can look mechanical. Bryce Young is just a little bit more free and loose in the way he operates. So I think that Slowick and DeMeco, who's obviously been in those systems a lot, practice against those, might look at CJ Stroud a little bit differently.
What makes his arm talent is he's a rhythm thrower.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When he gets in a rhythm, whoo. But if he gets out of rhythm, like the Iowa game, things lead to turnovers. It leads to mistakes.
Yeah, so that's the big question. And I don't that's not like a narrative that's out there per se. I mean, a lot of the narrative on CJ Stroud is, can he create when things break down? Can he work, outside of the system when he has to? Can he improvise? Can he make plays with people in his face? And he answered some of those questions. I think it's a little too quick or easy to say that it's, like when things break down, he falls apart or something. Because I think that's not necessarily what happened. A lot of some of the bad games that people point to, like Northwestern, it was just blowing 40-mile-per-hour winds. I haven't actually gone back and watched every snap of the Iowa game. And since Van Ness and their pass rush in general is very well respected there, I'll go back and watch the entire Iowa game. But as far as a comp for this type of thrower, a rhythm guy, James Palmer brought up an interesting one.
Right.
You know who they think he's like?
Who?
Dak.
Okay.
Dak is like that.
Yep.
Like Dak stays in a rhythm. I'm here. Sure. And then all of a sudden it's that's when the mistakes happen. Now I was told that, but also they were like, but CJ as a whole still made very few mistakes.
Correct.
But that's when his mistakes happened, was when it kind of got so deep into the progressions where it's like, okay, I'm kind of out of options here.
Yeah. And, aside from that, I think that there is the question and the projection that you have to make is for Bryce Young to work. So let's say if his processing is higher and, and he doesn't have to be as much on rhythm, he can work at his own tempo or what have you. It has to be that much better because of the height discrepancy. That's why Drew Brees was as good as he was, because he was so good with the timing and rhythm that some of the height discrepancy didn't matter as much. And Bryce Young does a lot of things that are really, really good over the middle as a shorter quarterback. And a lot of that comes down to his pocket awareness and presence. His ability to maneuver within the pocket is very, very good. That's something that shorter guys have to be able to kind of move their feet to get in the lane. Taller guys don't necessarily have to move their feet as much to get in the lane, but Bryce Young shows that ability. It's just that it's still going to be a detriment that he has the height. It doesn't get tested as much. Just like Ohio State with CJ Stroud, it didn't get tested as much because he was playing behind a really good offensive line. I don't look at that as like the breaking. That I don't think that CJ Stroud and everything they just said about him, I don't think that's the thing that ends up being the deciding difference between those two. I think there are a lot of other things to go off of.
The way he throws the football, it's quick.
Yes.
It's kind of a different release. Some teams can't put their finger on it.
Yeah.
We're talking about CJ Stroud here.
But it's kind of like some teams have said it's robotic but not stiff, which is a weird thing to say, but I get it. And the point that they need him to succeed in the next level, and this is what they say he needs to do because of everything you're saying with the way he throws the ball, he needs to be able to throw the ball with a guy in his face.
Yeah, and I think that old narrative about him not having to do that often and that being a negative against him. I think the Georgia game answered a lot of those questions in that it wasn't just him scrambling to buy time. It was him at times with people in his face making really good throws. And he did it at other points during the season too. He just didn't have to do it as consistently as some other guys have. But I also think there were times where he didn't have to do it because he was smart about getting rid of the football. And that's not often. Remember, if you lived through David Carr, and David, who when he was a younger player would tell you, he just didn't know when to throw the ball away. And a lot of bad decisions, or a lot of, you could play hero ball, or if you're on a team like Ohio State, you can be smart about throwing the ball away. You can be smart about doing the checkdowns. You can be smart about doing things before you get in harm's way that you can see without having to say like, oh, okay, he hasn't seen enough adversity. So that part of it, I'm not as critical on CJ Stroud as I think a lot of other people are. This part though, I'm glad that James Palmer talked about this. This is the maybe most nuanced and probably best explanation I've heard for how the Panthers and Frank Reich specifically are looking at Bryce Young's height and how they're evaluating it.
They're in a different mindset than the Texans are about it. And that's just everybody's mindset is different. And theirs is very, if you listen to Frank Reich or you listen, to Fitter, you hear a very weighing the pros and cons of it. Like they're really looking at it from every possible angle about why it is. Why? Because Frank Reich's never played with a short quarterback. Ever. 17 years. I think he's played like a handful of snaps with a guy under 6'4". Like it's just what he knows. And so there is a lot of questions and pros and cons about it that they want to try to have answered.
Yeah, and like that just makes sense. I think the fact that they really want to investigate it and the fact that height is a factor, it's not insurmountable, it's not as much of a negative as it used to be, but it is a factor. They bring up something here in a couple clips from now that's relevant to that is really interesting to me, because Steve Smith absolutely loves Bryce Young, but he's the one that brings us up about Bryce Young. Like to the point I had to listen to it 4 times to be sure I heard who he was talking about. As far as Frank Reich evaluating the shorter quarterbacks, the way James framed it makes the most sense, because we keep hearing, well, nope, the Panthers don't like Bryce Young, or we did hear they don't like Bryce Young because Frank Reich has only ever coached quarterbacks who are 6'3" and taller, which the vast majority of NFL quarterbacks are. It makes a lot more sense that he would say, okay, look, I don't know what it's like coaching these guys. I don't really know exactly what kind of challenges they'll face and how I would adapt to it. So I really want to think about this. So that makes sense. As far as the Panthers knowing who they want, there was an article in The Athletic a couple weeks ago in which they reference Fitterer, the GM of the Panthers. It says Fitterer said he'll probably ask Reich who his guy is a week or two before the April 27th start to the draft. Until then, Fitterer said everyone can go through the process without feeling any bias based on what other coaches or scouts believe. And that's not uncommon. GMs and coaches don't want their scouts' opinions or recommendations to be skewed by what the big man thinks. And likewise, the GM and the head coach, they want to come to their own conclusions and then bounce it off of the other guy. And that way you don't get groupthink. Like the modern GMs try to be really, really good about avoiding personal biases, blind spots, all that stuff. So I think that right now they are in that evaluation mode. And I don't know why. I don't know why we're so surprised when you hear like, oh, somebody in the organization really thinks Bryce Young is a quality quarterback. Yeah, that seems to be the consensus. And likewise, CJ Stroud, they seems like they like the play of CJ Stroud. Did quite well in college. So I'm not completely sold on there actually being a favorite now, other than that. I think more people are coming around on Bryce Young despite his size. Okay, so this is the one. This is Steve Smith talking about Bryce Young's athleticism. This caught me by surprise because it's something that's true, and yet I think it's under discussed. Maybe I'm just not looking in the right places. But this could be a big deal.
And then the other part that teams are kind of concerned about or weighing the options are, he doesn't really run away from people. Some teams say he's fast, but other teams are like, when our most talented guys were chasing him, they chased him down.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think he's running away from guys. He's not Kyler Murray.
I think one of the traits that he doesn't do well is he doesn't get away from people, and he drops his eyes. Bryce Young drops his eyes when he takes off running. So there's times where he has the ability to extend the play, but he drops his eyes, so he loses sometimes where his guys are.
Yeah, and like that again, that's not insurmountable, but I think the fact that it's a combination of dropping the eyes, which, I mean, I remember Deshaun came into the league, and I thought he was doing a good job of not dropping his eyes in that after he got hit in the kidneys about a dozen or 5 dozen times. He did develop into some bad habits of staring at the rush, and then he learned to get his eyes back downfield again. That was over the course of like 3 seasons. It was a little bit of a seesaw, and understandably so. But I think that's something that Bryce Young is definitely capable of improving on. And I don't think it's as big an issue as it is for the vast majority of quarterbacks. But I think the fact that, James Palmer in another part in here talked about the guys in the SEC were saying, hey, he's not running away from our fastest guys. That's something to think about. Think about like Johnny Manziel and like how elusive he was in college. And then he got to the NFL and you're like, oh, he's not so elusive, is he? And I think Bryce Young maybe is in that same category where he's plenty athletic, but he's not NFL fast. Case Keenum ran around and eluded a lot of would-be rushers, different size conference and defenders than the SEC, but still, I think that's where, again, you got to be so confident in the processing of Bryce Young that he's going to be able to overcome the fact that he's not going to be able to elude as many guys. That movement within the pocket is where he's going to really have to make his living. Take some of the comments here. We'll work backwards. You can't not love Steve Smith. He was a dog on the field and cool off the field. I think so too. I think a lot of people might disagree with him with some of the things like his overt love for Bryce Young to the point of almost uncomfortability. That's I've grown comfortable with it because I see it comes from a genuine place, and he's not using it like, okay, if Steve Young were to go like full heel turn and be like sports radio guy or something, he would turn it into, hey, I love Bryce Young, so I'm going to bash CJ Stroud. And he's certainly not doing that. And I think very few people are. I think for the most part, they're just they're calling it like it is. Why do so many draft experts say the Texans might pass on a QB if Young goes number 1, if they not read the tea leaves coming out of Houston? A couple things. I would guess that, one, they have not read the tea leaves because we're still in that let's get ignored. It's funny. This time of year around the draft, you get a lot of attention, and yet it's not in such a way that people really dive into the Texans themselves or the Panthers themselves. I was looking for some articles in Carolina or from the Panthers, so from some Charlotte sources and everything. And it's funny because the exact same stuff that we'd say in Houston is being said in Carolina right now. Everybody's convinced that as soon as the Panthers select either Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, the narrative is going to be, yep, look at that. Texans end up getting the better draft, even though they had the second pick. Well, here we're convinced that everybody's going to think we're idiots because we went and won the last game and all of that. So people do a lot of deep diving into the prospects themselves, but they don't pay that much attention to whatever DeMeco is saying or Cal McNair or anything. Plus, because it's lying season, They just don't believe coaches in general. They don't know that DeMeco is pure of soul and heart, and that he would never lie. Damn it. He might. Who knows though? He might throw out some smoke. I also wonder if Peter King throwing out there that Nick Caserio might go the conservative route and not draft a quarterback at all. That feels very much like a hypothetical of somebody who knows Caserio well saying, hey, you know what? Peter King would probably like some interesting nuggets. I'm going to just throw this out here. I could see Nick not doing this. And then one thing I've noticed just being on the media side of things that I have to be very careful of is like reading anything more than face value into anybody else's opinion. I think sometimes people involved in a team will give you their opinion without trying to imply that that's what they know somebody else is thinking. They're just genuinely giving their opinion. And sometimes it's relatively baseless. It's just that guy's opinion. Whatever one individual in Carolina feels about CJ Stroud or Bryce Young doesn't mean that that's what everybody feels from the top down. It's just everybody has their own independent feelings. Do we know what the other QB prospects scored? I've heard that while Young may have scored super high, the other top prospects still scored very high as well. That's a very, very good question. So talking about that S2 cognition test, the visual cognition test. Yeah, that's I had read that a lot of the prospects in this year's class scored high on that test. And again, I wonder if part of that is just that like the players know that they're being evaluated on this now. So just like guys like Davis Mills supposedly ran a 4.540. When you practice for a test over and over and over again, you get really good at taking that test without necessarily actually being better at whatever it's supposed to measure. Like you can cut 0.2 of a second off of your 40 time in an afternoon just by not actually getting faster, but by learning how to start properly and how to like a couple little tweaks to your running form. It doesn't make you faster in a football game yet, but likewise with some of these tests, especially when they're new, I think we might be at the steep part of the curve right now. So I'm hesitant to fully buy into that just yet. Other than that, also the guys that are practicing that test are probably pretty bright about other things too. Yeah, since DJ leaked that processing test on Young, I'd be kind of pissed if I were the other QBs. Yeah, and I think that might have come out of Bryce Young's people knowing that like, hey, this is a good thing to leak. Sometimes, often when something is leaked, it's coming and it's beneficial to the player. Look to the agent, look to the player himself, whoever it might be. Let's see. Apologize for all the microphone issues earlier in this session of ours. Can we get Steve Smith a clock necklace? Because dude is talking that Flava Flav hype man role for Bryce. Quite serious. Yeah. He's in love with him. And I do think it's a genuine football love. I don't think it's him trying to portray some character or anything. Like when like Nick, like my friend Nick Wright, when he went on the full bore LeBron hype train, he chose to also tear down Kevin Durant. He's like full bore 100% media guy. Steve Smith is not that guy. He's like he's trying to speak emotionally about the guys he really likes. Oh, I do encourage you to go subscribe to his podcast. It is really, really good. He talks in there about types of leadership, and he's very open and honest about how he was I don't want to say a bad leader, but his version of leadership fell short a lot of times when he was younger because he was like a my way or the highway type of guy. He was peak bad Steve Smith, whatever, bad in the good way, bad in the bad way, whatever it is. It's something he learned over time is where he needs to tamp it down a little bit. Let's see. How do you feel about Tyree Wilson at 12? I'd love Tyree Wilson at 12. If they wanted to trade up for Tyree Wilson, I'd be super cool with that too. I like Tyree Wilson a lot. As Chris says, Wilson's a pipe dream at 12. Oh, that's a good point. Oh, damn it, Cooper Media. That's a really good point. Steve Smith roots for the smaller guys that overcome the criticism. That is a really good point. Let me play this. Since we're talking about psychology and bias and test taking and all of those things. It's appropriate they would talk about Steve Smith and perhaps taking up for the little guy. Steve Smith in that podcast, cut to it, the episode I linked in the description, he tells a really funny story about when he was in Baltimore and Gary Kubiak was there, and Kubiak was trying to explain to him how to run routes, and he was using Andre Johnson as an example, and Steve Smith was like, listen, I'm not going to be able to do what Andre Johnson did. That's just not my skill set. I'm more of I like to take a little artistic license with the routes. So here is, for those of you who missed it, this was Steve Smith when he first fell in love with Bryce Young after the Alabama Pro Day.
When you just approach him and talk to him, that has
it all the way over.
You look at the stats.
There we go.
Also, too, there were some other routes going across the middle. Your height is, some of the measurables, but yet when you look at the stats, you were the most accurate and highest completion rate over the middle. So you understand the throwing lanes. And then that was just why you were throwing it. But then more than anything, just your quiet feet, quick feet, the way you hold the ball, your quick release, everything that I've seen out of there, for me, I've seen bigger, more athletic quarterbacks not be able to anticipate the throw. That's not a knock on anybody, so before people start tweeting, you know who I'm talking about. I'm just talking overall in this evaluation process of a guy who's smaller in the measurables but has the heart and the desire to play. Man, I just sat there and watched you, and I'm 44, I'll be 44 years old. I could have got out there and ran those routes, just the way you were guiding the ball. It was remarkable. I mean, I'm just like, I can lace them up. I can't do nothing, but it just sure looked good watching it, man. What a wonderful, wonderful display of why you deserve to be the first overall quarterback to be picked in this year's draft.
I really appreciate it. That means the world.
I like that. I like Garofalo. Just kind of. So, and as Cooper Media says, he's not saying he's biased. I like Young better too. Yeah, I don't. Okay, whether it's bias or not, like the halo effect. This is we talked about this earlier. Like once you realize you've given somebody the halo effect, and this is something that like scouts and GMs try to be very cognizant of, you start to look at everything anybody does as a positive, or like they just nobody throws an incompletion quite like Bryce Young. It feels like Steve Smith isn't on guard for that stuff, and that maybe that's crept into a little bit. But as far as the smaller side goes, I do think Steve Smith might be keenly he might be very acutely aware of when size is used against people in unfair ways. And that's how it was for quarterbacks forever, and he's pointing out right there, like immediately you think small quarterback, like, oh, okay, over the middle of the field, I don't know, going to be garbage over the middle of the field, where Bryce Young actually excels over the middle of the field because he is very adept at getting into lanes, understanding how he has to move within the pocket. He has a very good sense for where the weak spot in the pass protection is. So he's able to kind of, move away from that and keep his peripheral vision on that. So all of that is very much true. One thing we talked about on the show this morning, and it came to me as I was watching this and watching them talk about some of these size issues, was if you look at like Bryce Young and compare him to great smaller athletes in other sports. So Jose Altuve, Mike Tyson, very short as a heavyweight boxer goes. Aaron Donald, very short as a defensive tackle. Look, they do a couple of things. All those guys, use their size to their advantage. Altuve, for one, obviously it helps his strike zone, which is overstated sometimes, but it helps his strike zone. But also get the bat around a lot quicker with shorter arms, all those things. He can use that to his advantage. But you better use it to your advantage, because if you don't, you're screwed. Like it's one of those weird things. I used to think it was just because of the bias in the system that, like, how could it be that Altuve was at one point the best player in baseball, but also the shortest player in baseball? Like, how come there weren't guys that were 5'7", 5'8", 5'9", that also had made the major leagues. But I think part of it is simply that, like, the size is enough of a barrier that if you don't overcome it with other great things and turn that size into your strength, then yeah, you're going to wash out completely. So with Bryce Young, the question becomes, what is it about his diminutive nature, like, that either works for him or that he can offset with other things? My God, I don't know why this does this to me on this show and not when I'm doing. Oh, I guess Sean Pendergast wants to talk more than I realize. So I think I don't know if there's anything about his size specifically. Like with Aaron Donald, his size helps him because Aaron Donald is an immovable rock when he gets double teamed. Like in the run game, he could have been a nose tackle if he wanted to. Put on 20 pounds, would have been a nose tackle just fine. So his size, by having a low center of gravity, works really well. Mike Tyson would get up underneath guys and just destroy them with his power and his leverage, So I don't know if Bryce Young's size can be his advantage, but I think his anticipation can overcome it. Like, so it has to be that great to overcome his size. And that's going to be it for today because I got to work in the morning. So please subscribe and tell somebody about it, and subscribe to Steve Smith's podcast. One more thing. Hopefully going to have James Palmer either on here or on Payne and the Pendergast sometime very soon.
You.
Yeah. Oh, so the question
We'll
is,
watch this film.
how did you think you did? Hey, man, they got in my ear. I was salivating over here. Boy, it was. I'm telling you, dog.
Listen, that was my fault. I asked the question of you.
It was like listening to like Coltrane. It was just music. It was just great music.
So when you hear that coming from a guy like Steve Smith with his accomplishments, what goes through your head? What do you hear?
I mean, I'm super grateful from a legend hearing that. That means everything. But also it's super humbling. That means that I have to continue to keep perfecting my craft. It's encouraging, but I know that the job's not done. There's a lot more that I want to improve on, get better at, and there's a long journey ahead. My future, wherever that's at, and I'm grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah.
But hearing that from you, I mean, that's just humbling.
So, maybe my wife suggested this the other day. She's like, Seth, maybe, Lamont, let me take that off because otherwise it's just going to look like you think I'm creepy. She's like, do you have to shout like you do? I'm like, oh, I get animated. I'm like Steve Smith. I get excited about stuff. But she thought maybe the other thing we've learned too is that when I don't talk loud, all the energy drains from my voice. So I'll work on that. I'll work on that. Cooper Media makes a good point, which is hopefully Bryce is slippery enough because there's less to grab, so harder to tackle in the backfield. I think where I would go with that as far as the slippery part is that there is a benefit to being too small to see. Like when you play against Maurice Jones-Drew or running backs like Warwick Dunn, it's a pain in the ass to try to find them. Like you really are. It's like you could have a really good down going. And like, let's say I'm a defensive tackle and I got my guy locked out and I'm sitting in my gap, waiting to, I know where the play's going, but I'm going to wait to throw to the running back at the right moment. And then you go to throw to him and you just can't find the guy because the tiny little backs are kind of darting in and out. Doug Flutie was that way to a certain point, because he was very athletic and he would scramble and it was hard to locate him sometimes. So I think there's something to be said for that. If he can turn that into a strength and be elusive because of it, then maybe. I was thinking too. Yeah, we'll call it a day. I got to protect my voice. So please subscribe, tell a friend, all that stuff. Thanks, everybody.